It's a good morning. It's a good morning. I don't know, it's brisk outside. That gives me energy. I don't know about you guys. It's freezing, so. And, it's one of those things where you just find ways to embrace the reality of the frozen tundra. And we've had 3 days in a row that I think have, at least wind chill-wise, gotten below zero. But I hope you're doing well this morning. Yesterday we had a beautiful wedding for a really amazing couple. And I just kept thinking, extremely genuine, just genuine. And it was an amazing experience, and they wanted to take pictures out in the garden. I was like, okay, that's a challenge. So I shoveled out there, and I started shoveling and realized, there's like 3 or 4 snows that have happened. Is that how you say it? So there's some ice under there, and that plastic $20 shovel was not doing the trick. I ended up breaking it, couldn't get through it. So I was like, I'll try that old shovel, but I don't know. And I got it out there, and the thing's super heavy, and it's probably, 60 years old. Perfect. It was like a snowplow. I was like, okay, well, there it is. Old things sometimes are just better made, and we've all experienced that. And, it's okay, Odie knows, celebrating up there. But it's the same with our house. I talked about it last week, just a little bit on it, but floors are unlevel, walls are crooked. We're finding more of that out, but the bones are good. It's made well. There's some really big beams in the basement. The bones are good. Last week we talked about the importance of fresh starts in conjunction with the symbolism of a new year, because it's 2022. It's a new year. It's not 2021 continued. That's what I'm praying. 2022. This week, I want to continue the conversation about being made new. And I want to give you an update on our house a little bit in the process, because that's just what's happening in our lives right now. And I mentioned we had to fix some loose wiring. Could not do that. We actually just had to pull that stuff out of the wall and start over to make sure everything was safe. And that was a smart move. So in contrast to the new and old shovel, this time the old thing needed to be replaced with something new. So it's not always the case that the old thing is higher quality, but in our own experiences, sometimes old thoughts need to be replaced with new ones too. You know what I'm talking about. When I was living in Washington, D.C., I was dealing with a major faith crisis. There were some old beliefs that were actually very comforting to me. They were familiar, and I had stopped believing in them altogether. Have you ever been there? You ever had an old belief that just, it was kind of almost what built you and shaped you, and then all of a sudden it's gone. I had taken to heart something else too in our church over the years that I was taught, and it was this. And I know maybe for some of you this sounds crazy, but I really thought that I was inherently unworthy of God's love. I thought God was angry with me. I really thought that this whole Jesus thing was about appeasing the angry God figure, really to satisfy God's wrath against humanity. And I was taught this. I love the people who taught me. Have you ever been taught this? Do you still believe it today in some shape or form? Maybe you do. Well, a preacher's kid came along when I was in Washington, D.C., and he was a lawyer on Capitol Hill, and he asked me and Chrissy this very bold question. He asked me this bold question. It was this: do you believe that God is proud of who you are today? I thought about it for a split second, and I had to honestly say, wow, Jim, I don't know if I would go that far. I don't really know if I would go that far, but that question kind of haunted me for a while, months. This question haunted me, and I wrestled with and eventually found myself in the upper level of our church in Washington, D.C., listening to a sermon on my phone, an Easter sermon, and the preacher was talking to me. I knew it. And about halfway through the message, I truly felt like this huge pressure, just laid on my chest. And I laid down in the sanctuary and cried. It never happened to me before, and I remember even stretching my arms out, and within probably about 30 seconds, the pressure started to subside, and it was as if I'd been set free from something I didn't even know I'd been held captive to. It was this reckoning with something we all face at different times in our lives. It was this reckoning with the pressure to perform, to meet some unrealistic demands, to measure up to some lofty standard, to maybe someday do enough to make God proud of me. And all that pressure that I felt on my chest that subsided, it just went away. It went away. It was beautiful. It was like an existential debt that I felt I owed God, I owed my parents, I owed everyone else to measure up to some unrealistic standard. And it was gone. It was paid off in a sense. It was like I was finally free and I had discovered something. This profound truth, and I still believe it to my core today, that God, like the most loving parent, is proud of who I am down to the most vulnerable, honest part of who I am. God is proud of me. I am inherently worthy of God's love, and God said so. God said so. Let's turn to Genesis, the first book of the Bible, a collection of ancient Jewish texts. And Genesis 1:31 gives us the clearest picture of who we are at our core. In Genesis 1, the author paints really a beautiful picture of this origin story where God hovers over the waters. God's Spirit hovers over the waters. And there's this one line that's so poetic, and it's really incredible. It says, "Darkness was over the surface of the deep." Whew. Thousands of years ago, someone wrote that. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. So, and then the story goes, there was light and sky and land and sea and plants and sun and moon, animals. And then came what God may have found the crowning achievement, humankind. Now, this was an oral tradition for the elders to share the story to their children and pass it along from generation to generation. And what was the prevailing truth in all of it? What I like is that the very last verse of Genesis 1 says it all. Genesis 1:31. This is the Message translation, and I like to use this every once in a while, but the late Eugene Peterson had something to say here. God looked over everything he had made, and it was so good. So very good. This is something I find really valuable about reading the Message, because a lot of other translations simply saying it was good. But there's a word that actually came before good, the Hebrew word mehod, which actually means with strong passion, even means vehemently, which I think is ironic because you usually use that word in a negative way, but vehemently, even that definition is intensity, passion, strong energy. So it wasn't just simply good, it was unbelievably good. God looked over everything God had made, and it was so very good. Sometimes when I think about this, I wonder if we got so caught up in another story in the Bible that we forgot the original story. It's tempting to just skip forward 2 chapters to Genesis 3 and conclude that we're actually inherently evil beings. It's tempting to do that. Cursed by God for the actions of Adam and Eve, eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? We read that story, and we were told it as kids, and we looked at all the pictures and things in there, and well, I really believe there's some news for us. Whether you believe Adam and Eve's story is literal historical, possibly metaphorical. Absolutely nowhere in the story of the fall of humankind do we read that God actually cursed Adam and Eve. Go read it. We don't have time. But nowhere in Genesis 3 does God actually curse Adam or Eve. Go read it. It's just kind of incredible. So read it for yourself. What did happen, though, in Genesis 3 is that Adam and Eve forgot the original story. That they were made unbelievably good, so very good. Instead, they were convinced that God was going to abandon them, and they hid and covered themselves. In Genesis 3:10, Adam said, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid." And God said, "Who told you that you were naked?" This is the question, and I think we can read it today as this: who told you that you were unworthy? Why have you believed this? I made you, and I said it was very, very good. You know, I think about it, and I wonder if our human struggle is simply learning to get rid of this age-old belief and replacing it with something new, which is actually ancient. It's the most ancient truth of all, and it's that you are worthy of God's love because God said so. I was thinking about it, and when we don't really know our worth, we've all gone through this in our lives. It's part of the journey. When we don't know our worth, we sometimes sell out for cheap, artificial versions of what looks like love, but aren't really love at all. It's like that old shovel. I didn't have a clue how good that shovel was, so I went for the cheap plastic one, and it broke. Once I got my hands on that solid wood and that heavy blade, I knew I would never go back to that brand new $20 plastic shovel. So when we don't know our worth, we settle. We lose our confidence. We constantly want to please everyone and win approval. When we don't know our worth, we don't think we deserve joy or happiness. We neglect our own needs. We settle for a partner that doesn't respect us or treat us well. We put up walls and close off any chance of real connection, and we were made for connection. We were designed for and deserve real connection. And 1 John 4:7 says this: "Beloved, let us love one another. For love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God." You're born of God, made to connect, made to love. We are worthy of God's love because God said so. Don't forget the origin story. We were made very, very unbelievably good, and now may our hearts and minds be made new. The old belief in an archaic, angry God be torn out of the rafters, like that old wire that just wasn't useful anymore, because it's not useful anymore. So we tear that old belief in an angry God out of the wires and replace it with a brand new truth that is ironically as old as time. You're worthy of God's love because God said so. So the pressure to perform, to meet unrealistic demands, to measure up to some lofty standard, to maybe someday make God proud of us, all of that just gone. Not useful anymore. Replaced with brand new, unconditional, non-judgmental love. And when we find ourselves having a hard time believe we are worthy of this love, we can just start over. Remember the origin story. God said humankind was very, very good. And I'll leave you with this quote. Nothing in the universe can stop you from letting go and starting over. And that's just a beautiful truth today that whatever it is that holds me back, nothing in the universe can stop me from letting go and starting over. You are worthy of God's love because God said so. Let's pray. God, when I find times in my life where I close myself off to love and to connection, I pray that you will remind me of the origin story. They'll help me to remember that I actually do deserve connection just like everyone else. Help me to open back up. Help me to surrender whatever fears I have, whatever desires to win everyone's approval, whatever expectations and pressures to measure up, to meet some unrealistic version of myself. And I pray as we go out of this place, as we sing this final song together, that you will help us to never forget, or at least to remind us of this origin story. That you saw everything you made and you said, it was so good. It was so very good. In your heavenly name, amen.